What's up, everybody? My name is David Pere, and I am the host of the Millionaire podcast. And I wanted to address something that I've heard all throughout Bigger Pockets, throughout forums, throughout Google. It's becoming a common topic, and that is the idea that military bases are areas you should invest in. So the advice that you should buy near military bases because they are recession resistant. Now, while this area sounds solid, there are some things you aren't considering, and I would like to point these out because I like to be the bearer of bad news, or maybe I just like to think objectively. So before you go and dump your entire portfolio into an area just because it's got a military base around it, you need to watch this entire video for the pros and cons to doing so, and then let me know in the comments if you liked it. All right, so first off, are military bases recession resistant or recession proof? All right, the first piece is BAH. One of the reasons people look at this is the basic allowance for housing, or BAH, which is a tax-exempt benefit that we get as service members for housing. So, for example, I'm here in San Diego right now. I get $3,105 every month, tax-free, for housing. Now, it's incredible, and that's one of the reasons that people look at tax recession proof is because that number can't go down for me right now. So if I move to a new location, it can go down to whatever that location's is. Like if I move to Missouri, it's like $800 or $900, but it varies to cover your costs as far as housing go. But while I'm here, it can't go down. So even if the market tanks, I'm still locked into the rate that I had originally when I moved here because I can't, like, they don't want me to be in a lease that's $3,000 and then my $3,000 drops to $2,600. Now I struggle to make my payment. So I'm locked in at whatever rate when I originally got here and locked on housing, which is great. Also, it is known to at least a decent amount of people that your command will step in if you miss payment. So, renting to service members actually adds a little layer of security because you know they're going to pay rent. And if for whatever reason they don't, you can just contact their command who can essentially force them to pay or even set up direct deposits, because if a service member becomes behind on debt and ends up in collections or has credit issues or bankruptcy or whatever, it can actually hurt them really badly in their career, especially if they require secret clearance, because bankruptcy and financial issues can and will get you removed from being eligible for a secret clearance or a top secret clearance or a top secret compartmentalized information clearance or whatever, because it makes you easier to have extortion used against you or whatever those tactics are. Because in theory, if you are really struggling financially, then it's more tempting for you to do something unrecommended per se for money. So that is something that is highly looked at. So a command will absolutely step in for two reasons. One, they don't want the reputation of their command or the military tarnished by bad tenants out in town. And two, because it can hurt them in their career and their security clearance. So, people hesitate to call the command on that, but at the end of the day, like, you're doing the service member a favor, because if he ends up in default or something, it can really hurt their career. So just notify if they're, make sure you get their info and then notify the command if something goes wrong, and you'll get your money, right? Because that's what they get the housing allowance for. Now, this is not true for everybody, but military tenants are generally clean people. And I say that that's not true for everybody, but if you were to look at my house, it's very well kept. It's organized, it's neat, it's clean. Sure, there's some extra stuff laying around because I accumulate gear throughout the years, but overall, tidy house, good tenant, it'll be turned over well. Now, there are obviously downsides to that, but, there's downsides to that with every tenant, and I would argue that statistically, majority of military tenants are probably cleaner and better tenants than majority of non-military tenants if you were to compare apples to apples. Another benefit is that military bases have the potential to grow or plus up, especially during like wartime. So if you were looking at like Camp Pendleton in 2006 through 2008, I don't know the numbers, but I know that they grew a lot as far as more infantry, more personnel. The military in general was growing. So more people were needing to get to different bases. As Camp Pendleton expanded, so did more military people seeking housing, which just grew the economy, grew the market, right? Everybody looks at population factors is one of the things you look at when you're choosing a market. So the fact that can happen is great. And, that's cool. You can actually, I've thought about this before, if you're going to invest in military towns, try to see if you can get a hold of the local personnel office on that base and ask, say, like, hey, do you guys have a scope for what the next 5-year plan is for population on that base? And they may tell you, yeah, we're actually looking at growing or cutting back or whatever. And that plan can definitely change. But that's a good bit of research for you to do. And if the base is growing, then that provides you a large opportunity as a landlord. Now, as with everything, there are downsides to renting to military members as well. And these are the things that I really haven't seen getting discussed too much. And I want to bring some of these to attention just so that you are aware of them. The first is that they're not going to be long-term tenants. Now, they may be a 1 year, a 2 year, or a 3 year lease. That's true. But the odds are they won't be more than that. Sometimes a person gets stationed somewhere for 4, 5, 6 years. But generally speaking, the average military duty station is a 2 or a 3 year set of orders, and then you're gone. And so if you rent to somebody, you should never expect more than 2 or 3 years. Now, that's great. 2 or 3 years is good. But, I have some tenants in Missouri who've lived in the same house for 10, 14, 15. I think I've got one for like 17 years. And not to say that that's always the case, but, you're as you average things out, your average is probably lower just because you will never get above that, 3-year mark, very, very rarely, but you can get lower. So I don't know, take that for a grain of salt, but just understand that you're going to have turnover, every 2 to 3 years, which is not terrible by any means, but it does mean that there's not an opportunity for that to go much longer. And I already kind of mentioned the turnover, but you will have turnover. So just be ready for that. With the turnover, there's a piece that a lot of people don't appreciate, and that's that they can break their lease early without a penalty. So if somebody's on a 3-year lease and then they get orders at the 2-year mark, 30-day notice and they're gone. You can't do anything about it. Now, granted, they have to have orders. They should have to show you a copy of these orders. It has to be legitimate, not just them, griping about whatever or stating whatever. But I mean, that even if you see their orders, it could be that they don't need to be at their new duty station until, no later than July 30th. They may want to check in at their earlier than date, which is July 1st, depending on if they want to leave the command they're at right now or not. And then that means they might take 30 days vacation time, depending on where they're going. So that means they might leave by June 1st, which means that they might get packed out of their house by May 15th or whenever the movers can schedule. So, you look at these orders and they may be breaking the lease 2 or 3 months before they have to, in your eyes, just because, they've got to move, they've got to take vacation time on the way to their duty station. They have to wait for their stuff to move from one side of the nation or world to the other side of the nation or world. And so there's a lot of invariables there. But ultimately, if they drop you a notice within 30 days, and sometimes, honestly, it even comes less than that if they get really last-minute orders, but that's rare, just be aware of that. And that could even be for a deployment. Sometimes a service member gets orders to a deployment and they move their family back home because, if they have a young spouse who doesn't have any friends or know anybody at that base, it might be easier to just send them home for the 7 months, 8 months that they're deployed. And so they could theoretically break that lease and send their spouse home or their family home. And there's not really anything you can do about it. So in that case, which that's rare right now because we're not really in combat, we're not deploying a whole bunch. But, in times of war, be aware that somebody could rent a place from you and theoretically 4 months later, they get deployed and they could break the lease. There's nothing you can do about it. So just know that that's a possibility and don't try to fight the system. Don't be the civilian who gets themselves blacklisted or the military person. Don't be the landlord who gets themselves blacklisted by not understanding that and just going out of their way to make life difficult on the service members. Just accept it. That's one of the risks of renting to service members. Oh, and I didn't mention it. I mentioned deployments and PCS, but that can actually happen for promotion too. If someone gets promoted, they may not be able to stay at that job and have to get transferred. Usually when that happens, they try to transfer that person to a job in the same base, but not always the case. Another downside to investing in a military town is that appreciation does not necessarily occur as fast as it might in other surrounding areas because salaries don't usually outpace inflation much. So if you think of Silicon Valley, right? As tech industry was moving in there, salaries were skyrocketing and property value was skyrocketing. And you think of areas where Amazon moves in or, some of these places, there's a propensity for the market value to just really quickly rise because salaries are doing the same thing. Well, military salaries, while they do consistently generally go up, trend up in value, and they usually stay around inflation. So the odds are that you're not going to see excessive growth because the basic allowance for housing is based on housing expenses for the previous year. And if those go up, then you might see it the next year. But over time, you might get some of these things, but you shouldn't expect that a military market is going to just skyrocket in value. You should expect that it's going to be kind of even keel with inflation. It's not there's just, even if they do have more people coming in for jobs, there's just a limit to salaries and housing allowances. So that's something to be aware of. And the other downside to renting to military members is a base can close. So like make sure that the market you invest in can support you without a base. Now, if a base closes, that could be a detrimental to anybody in any market, depending on the size of the base. But it has happened before. There are plenty of military bases around the country that are no longer used or shrunk due to whatever restriction, or maybe they just weren't needed, or maybe the military made a pivot in what they were training for. And so you need to be aware of that. And again, that's, if you can reach your personnel office and talk to them, albeit briefly, to see kind of what the future looks like for your base, that'll give you a good idea. Or just do some homework, do some research. I would imagine that you would get a pretty big heads up if that was happening, but not even closing, the base can shrink and you may not know. If the military is downsizing, which happened to the Marine Corps in probably 2012, 2013, 2014 timeframe, we were downsizing back after the war. I mean, the Marine Corps shrunk 20, 30,000 troops, which is it was fairly substantial, 20, 30% of the military or the Marine Corps, maybe more, depending on, I forget highs and lows as far as population, but other services shrunk down as well. So those military bases, just as they expand when we plus up, they do the opposite when we shrink. So just be aware of that and understand that population can definitely affect your market, and understand you need to be in a market that can affect its, effectively sustain itself, whether the base is there or not. All right, so are military markets and military towns where you should buy real estate? Well, as with every good question, the answer is that the situation will dictate, or it depends. I'm reading this because I wrote it down so I wouldn't mess it up. I would not pick up and change my entire location just because there's a base in the area, but it's not a terrible idea. As with everything, I recommend that you invest where you're comfortable and have a solid team. So look at everything holistically and determine if that's a market that you would want to be a part of, regardless of the military. And then look at the pros and cons, weigh those decisions. It very well can be recession resistant. There are a lot of benefits to investing to service, or investing in military towns and renting to service members, but there are some complications. There are some things you need to understand, and I don't want you to think it's all sunshine and rainbows. So I hope this helps, and I hope you got something out of this. If you made it this far and you liked the video, please subscribe so you get more content, and let me know. Do you like just this kind of talking point through, close-up video, or would you prefer more of my outside or moving around, energetic standing videos? I'd like to know. I'm trying to improve my channel, so give me a comment down below and tell me what you think, and I hope you have a great day.